A 16-year-old girl went for a run and disappeared. The police began an investigation, which will last 38 years. When the truth did come out, people were not exaggerated. It turned out that this case could have been solved in just a few weeks. But instead, it took almost 4 decades to find the answers. In this video, we'll tell you what happened to Joyce McLean. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. When she was little, her family moved to a tiny town called East Millinaket, located almost on the edge of the United States. From an early age, she was fond of music. The girl quickly mastered several instruments, but her favorite was a saxophone. She liked to compose her own compositions and was a member of the school's music group. In addition, she was a cheerleader, played football, and was generally very active in school life. At the end of the 1980 summer vacation, Joyce was struggling with her upcoming 17th birthday. She recently obtained her driver's license and planned to travel with friends and relatives to the lake to celebrate her birthday. The girl was even going to invite a local band there. Joyce had 2 more classes to finish, after which she planned to go to college. The girl prepared for this in advance, so she studied only well and also earned various sports and musical achievement. On August 8, she and her friends spent a day at the lake, after which she decided to go for a run. Joyce loved sports, but running was not her favorite thing to do. However, in the new school year, she was to participate in school football matches, and she did her best to keep fit. She went for a run around 7:30 p.m. She used to run around with her friend, but she was busy that night. Joyce had a standard route. She made a few laps along the road, going around her tiny little town. It usually took about an hour, but the girl never came home that night. It had been several hours since Joyce had left, and her mother was beginning to worry deeply. She had always informed her parents of where she was going, and if after a run she went for a walk with friends, her parents would already know about it. Her mother decided to go in search and drove around the city by car. She asked all the neighbors who got in her way, but no one saw Joyce. Given that in this small town, the vast majority of residents knew each other, several others joined the search. The night was coming, and the girl was still nowhere. Then worried parents decided to go to the police. Local officers immediately joined the search, and in the following hours, more and more of the city's residents took to the streets. They searched the route Joyce was on, as well as the area behind the school. Unfortunately, they could not find any trace of the girl. With each passing hour, panic grew, and few hoped to find Joyce alive and unharmed. It was a deep night in the yard, and the police completely ruled out the possibility that the girl might have gone somewhere with friends. The problem was that everyone she knew was at home and later joined the search. Joyce's parents just couldn't imagine their daughter going out alone until nightfall. The search was delayed for 2 days. During this time, the police, together with the residents of the city, continued to explore the area until, on 10 August, they finally made a heartbreaking discovery. Joyce's body was found just 60 meters from the school sports grounds, near the trees. The girl was lying on the ground. Almost all her clothes were missing, and her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of blue cloth. The police immediately realized that the victim had been severely hit on the head, but a more detailed analysis was to be done by medical experts. After examining the body, they concluded that the girl had been hit repeatedly on the head, and that her death occurred on the evening of the day she disappeared. Despite the virtual absence of clothing, the unknown perpetrator did not assault her. Unfortunately, no other information could be obtained. There were no foreign DNA samples on the body, and in the early 80s this technology was only at the initial level. The first person in history to be convicted by DNA was not arrested until 1987. Thus, the police would face a complex investigation with minimal evidence. Shortly after the body was discovered, officers discovered Joyce's clothes, but this did not bring them any closer to figuring it out. News of the brutal murder quickly spread throughout the city, plunging it into a very grim state. As usual, residents of these tiny towns in the wilderness have never faced murder. What was more disturbing was the fact that the killer was still around, his identity unknown. Given the complete lack of evidence, several theories spread throughout the city. The most popular was the following. Joyce's body was found near a place that didn't usually attract the most well-off youth. They often drank alcohol there at night, as well as taking illegal substances. People thought a bunch of these drunken guys might have been hitting on Joyce, and things got out of hand. The police even checked with local residents who spent regular time with those companies, but they were unable to establish their involvement. Another theory was that the killer might have been a seasonal worker. Hundreds of people came to this area all the time because local people alone were not enough for all the vacancy. But here too the police could not find any evidence. Someone even began to suspect a volunteer who discovered Joyce's body. The fact is that most of the time he surveyed the area in pairs with another volunteer. However, in the morning of the last day he went on the search one. Because of this, there was a theory about his involvement, but here too the police could not confirm his guilt. There was another version. Turns out the night Joyce disappeared, there was a serious accident near town. A 19-year-old local resident broke into the garage and stole from there a tanker. Then he crashed into another car. He suffered serious head injuries and went into a coma for 9 days. As a result, the police simply could not interrogate him, and when he came to, he said he wasn't. The investigators didn't know what to do. They had no evidence, no witnesses. As a result, the case went into a long draw for years, during which the police failed to get close. 8 years later, Joyce's family created a petition calling for the murder of their daughter to be included in a national broadcast on unsolved crimes. This would bring information to viewers across America and attract the attention of potential witnesses. There is always a possibility that someone heard or saw something, but for some reason did not report it to the police. The petition gathered 6,000 signatures, and the program's authors agreed to do the story. It came out in '89, and the police did receive a lot of calls, but all the information gathered was either erroneous or blatantly false. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every known case. People are either wrong, or they're just lying and making up facts that don't exist, making the police waste time and resources on background check. The case stood still for a few more years, but all the while, Joyce's mum was still fighting for the truth. In the mid to zero, she decided that new technologies and techniques in forensic science could help to uncover evidence that had been lost in the 1980s. For that, the experts had to exhume the victim's body, but there were difficulties. The authorities initially refused the mother's request for exhumation, and they believed that in almost 3 decades, any possible evidence simply did not survive. But the woman kept pushing her case, and in 2007, she managed to move the issue forward. The medical examiner, Peter Cummings of Massachusetts, contributed much to this. Joyce was only 5 years old at the time of his murder. Despite his young age, he remembered the horror of his city. Peter admitted that it was these events that sent him into the field of forensics and medicine. When he learned that the authorities had rejected Joyce's mother's request for an exhumation, he contacted her and asked her not to abandon the idea. Peter thought there might be enough residue to try and extract evidence from. He also contacted one of the leading United States forensic experts who took an interest in the case. Joyce's mum decided to take the initiative and organize an independent examination. The exhumation cost approximately $20,000, which the family did not have, but they had the support of people who cared about the case after all these years. With their help, the family quickly raised the required amount, and the exhumation took place in 2008. To the surprise of many, the experts did manage to find some important evidence, but at the time, they kept this information secret. The investigators only reported that the discovery would not be followed by an immediate arrest. However, the police immediately reopened the case. A few months later, it was reported that unidentified men had desecrated Joyce's grave. The police stated that they did not know if it had anything to do with the murder investigation. The next big turn happened a year later, in 2009. And this may have been a key point, because for the first time in 29 years, law enforcement has announced the existence of a prime suspect. Let's go back to 1980. As we recall, a few hours after Joyce's murder, a local resident hijacked a tanker and was in a serious accident, causing him to fall into a coma. The person in question was 19-year-old Scott Fournier, and in 2009 he was on trial for possession of prohibited material with minors. The two cases seemed unrelated. Only after sentencing, the judge suddenly declared Scott a person of interest in the Joyce McLean murder case, calling on the man to confess. This news surprised Joyce's relative. All of them knew Scott and knew that the police were treating him as a suspect because of the accident. But why the judge officially declared him a person of interest after 29 long years? Lead detective in this case refused to comment on the situation. He merely said that they had made significant progress since the exhumation and that the investigation was ongoing. Scott was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for possession of illegal materials. It was a minimum sentence despite having a criminal history. He was tried in 79, 80 and 84 for the fall. But all of these crimes happened too long ago to affect the length of the current case. He also went on the police radar in 2001 when his 6-year-old daughter complained that he had molested her. Despite the fact that law enforcement agencies believed the girl, it was not possible to prove the crime, and Scott was not punished. All of the above seems to be enough for a man to seriously consider Joyce's killer. But as it turned out, this is only the top and everything is much worse. Unfortunately, this case has dragged on for several years. While the man was in prison, investigators kept the collected evidence secret and interviewed possible witnesses. In 2015, they assembled a group of 10 men and reconnoitered the area where Joyce's body was found. At the end of the search, they did not give any details, but after a year, everything fell into place. On 4 March 2016, police officially announced the arrest of the suspect. Scott Fournier, who had just been released from prison, was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Joyce McLean. Scott, who was 55 years old at the time, refused to plead guilty and the case went to trial. While awaiting trial, he spent almost 2 years in prison because he did not have $300,000 to bail. The trial began only in 2018 and the public finally learned something really strange. It turns out that Scott repeatedly confessed to killing Joyce a few weeks after that. He once cried and confessed to his mother and sister that he had killed Joyce. On other occasions, he told a local priest, a family acquaintance, and a work colleague about his action. Some of these confessions did not reach the police until years later, but some came to light almost immediately. Scott was interrogated, but he began denying his guilt. The guy referred to head injuries sustained during the accident. According to him, he really thought he killed Joyce, but now he thinks it never really happened. In total, he was interrogated 27 times, and Scott constantly changed his story. He first told the police that he had killed Joyce by hitting her with a glass insulator from a power line that was lying nearby. The girl was indeed killed right under the power line. Scott further stated that he had tied her hands, abused her and fled. In this story, the police were confused by one fact. Firstly, they were not able to identify the murder weapon, although a glass isolator was found near the body. Secondly, Joyce was not subjected to violence, as testified by medical experts, but the rest of his story was very close to the truth. In subsequent interviews, he stated that he had killed Joyce in the company of other guys. Then he said he was just watching them attack her. He then changed his story again and said that these guys forced him to participate in the crime. There were a lot of stories like that, and the detectives were just confused during the investigation. They had no hard evidence against Scott, and his story changed every time he was questioned. That's why he hasn't been arrested in all these years. It was only in time that they were able to gather enough data to bring the case to trial. 2 witnesses, a priest and Scott's colleague, both of whom had heard Scott confess. A colleague asked the guy how he got away with it. Scott replied that he had simply bombarded the police with false stories about other people's involvement, and that had led them astray. A colleague reported the conversation to his superiors, but not to the police. Apparently, they never passed this information on to law enforcement. He confessed to the priest that he had not abused Joyce because she had her period at the time, and that was one of the key factors. The police never disclosed this information, even though they knew it after examining the girl's body. So Scott simply couldn't have known the details unless he was the killer. Scott's attorneys insisted that the evidence was circumstantial. Their defendant's confession was based on head injuries from the crash. They also referred to the fact that the police did not arrest the man immediately after he first confessed to the murder. Lawyers also reproached the court for refusing to examine other suspects. For example, they tried to blame the man who found Joyce's body on Peter. That morning, he was supposed to be out looking for a girl with another volunteer, and they agreed to meet at 6:00 a.m., but Peter never showed up. The volunteer later found out that he had gone out early and found the body, but there is also one strange moment. The volunteer's sister lived next door to Peter, and on the morning of that day, she saw a man leave the house at dawn. According to the woman in his hand, he had a large gym bag when he returned home after finding the body. He looked happy and smiling. This story seems dubious, if only because the volunteer did not report it to the police until 16 years after the murder. It already looks strange, and it's impossible to verify the authenticity of his word. Unfortunately, Peter Lally died of a heart attack just 2 days before Scott was arrested. For that reason, no one will ever know why he came out early, but the police said there was no evidence of his involvement in the murder. The prosecution denied all the lawyers' arguments, claiming that the police had considered all possible suspects and had failed to find even a hint of their involvement. Scott, on the other hand, has been suspicious many times. Even his stepfather, in the early stages of the investigation, told the police that he suspected Scott of murder. According to him, a few days before the incident, the guy said that he planned to start running at night. He also mentioned that he liked Joyce. Moreover, when Scott first confessed to the murder, he was asked to show us where he attacked Joyce. The guy led the investigators to the exact spot where the body was found. They cited several other witnesses as support for his involvement. The night of Joyce's murder, around 9:00 p.m., a couple saw Scott run past Joyce's murder scene with a bottle of liquor in his hand. Only they said an unidentified young man ran beside him. They did not know that the girl's body would be found there, but later reported it to the police. An hour and a half earlier, 2 local teenagers had also seen Scott and an unidentified young man flee the area. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and on 5 February 2018, the final judgment was rendered. Scott was convicted of Joyce's murder and sentenced to 45 years in prison. At the time, the man was 57 years old, and such a sentence effectively guaranteed that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Scott's lawyers filed an appeal in 2019, which led to a new trial. However, the court did not change the original sentence. In the judge's view, the evidence against the perpetrator was exhaustive and all the defense arguments were without weight. Joyce's relatives relieved themselves of the heavy burden of ignorance that had been with them for 38 years. All this time they fought for the truth, and her mother contributed the most. This woman dedicated her whole life to achieving justice. In the end, it went further and contributed to the adoption of a law that has led the authorities to invest heavily in the establishment of units to combat unsolved killing. In all of this, there's only one thing left to figure out who the other guy the witnesses saw was. Scott's involvement here is almost obvious. He knew so many details that the police never disclosed publicly. It's just impossible to chalk it up to guesswork. But what about 2 sets of witnesses who told the police the same thing? It's not like Scott committed this crime in the company of some other person. This moment is also questionable. After Joyce was killed, Scott stole a tanker and crashed, but he was the only one in the car. Where did his supposed partner go? It is possible that they separated immediately after the murder, and yet the theory of the second killer seems dubious. Share your opinion about this story, and don't forget to like it if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching it.